two problems in in our genetically embedded way. I want to look at the tools first. And we'll look at it in connection with the desertification. Desertification is not occurring in environments like that, where it's humid every day of the year. It doesn't matter what you do, and where civilizations failed in those environments, biodiversity recovered, and we find the ancient civilizations under the forest, under fully recovered vegetation. Where it's occurring is where it's seasonal, where there's a wet or a growing period in the year, and then a dormant or a dry period in the year. That is where the problem is occurring. Now, when we look at desertification, all right, what is causing it? Really, as I said, it's biodiversity loss, but what does that lead to? It leads to the rainfall being less effective. So the total rainfall doesn't change, it just becomes less effective. So let me explain that to you. Here we get it in the Tihama Desert. That's a picture I took one day on my way to a research station there while doing a job with the World Bank fellows, and 25 millimeters of rain was falling. And I took that picture, and you can see the rain running, etc. Now, that's a lot of rain. If you think of it in terms of drums of water, each containing 200 liters, that's 1,250 drums of water per hectare. What are you going to do with all that water? That's a hell of a lot of water. The next day, the land looked like that. Where had all that water gone? That's non-effective rainfall. That's a desert that shouldn't be a desert. Where that rainfall had gone, if we look at it, is some of it had run off, you could see it running off, and some had soaked into the soil. But the next day, as soon as it warmed up, that had soaked into the soil simply evaporated out, like you getting out of the shower and your hair drying. Just evaporated out of the soil. So that water had left across the soil or through the soil, not being used. Now, if we have a covered soil, let's see what happens. Now, with a covered soil, the bulk of that rain would have soaked in, and it would leave through the soil, flowing in under the soil to rivers, wetlands, aquifers, wells, etc. And what doesn't flow through the soil would leave the top of the soil through plants, not from the soil, not from the exposed soil. That is fully effective rainfall. And that 25 millimeters would have grown an awful lot of plants and produced a lot of water for river flow had it stayed in the soil, like that. Now, we're often told that this problem is only occurring in the drier areas. Well, here's a grassland in a high rainfall, more than you get here. This is about 900 to 1,000 millimeter, and it's a very random picture because the police stopped me for speeding. So that stopped me at that point, so I took a picture while dealing with the police. And looking into grasslands, as we should, we find that soil is as hard as this. It's just like cement. So the bulk of that water is flowing off, going to another country, Mozambique, and what does soak in is growing some vegetation, and not much is getting to rivers, so they're drying up. Now here's another grassland that most people would say that's a wonderful grassland, a beautiful grassland. No, it isn't. You mustn't look at grasslands, you must look down into them. And when we look down into that grassland, again, we find the soil is just like cement between the plants. So from that grassland, going down the river system, down the catchment, these are the floods. Enormous floods lower down. Now, that first began to click in my mind in 1960 when we had a terrible drought in Botswana, South Africa, Zimbabwe, but at the same time the International Red Cross was collecting money in the cities for the flood victims in Mozambique on the same river. So as a young man, I began to say, well, that doesn't make sense. How can our drought be their flood? There's something we're not understanding here. And this is pretty well the picture we see globally. All right, so going to the tools, as you know, this was always blamed on livestock. And that goes back centuries, blaming the nomads for causing the deserts, vilifying livestock. It's a major thing today. Many people are vegetarians because they want to help the environment, or vegans, they're producing films, etc. Well, let's look into it a little more accurately than that. What happens in these grasslands is that they grow during the growing period. And here you see one. It's come through 4 months of rain, about 600 millimeters. Okay, now the rain has stopped, the air is drying off, everything's drying off, and as you watch that, it changes to that. It's the exact same scene. So now nearly all of that grass is almost dead. Shortly it'll all be dead above ground. The grass plant is an underground plant mostly. The upper part is just leaves and gathering sunlight and sexual reproduction, etc. Most of the plant is underground. Now somehow that has to decay and get out of the way, and it's got 8 months to do so. And if it doesn't decay and get out of the way, and humans saw this thousands of years ago, if it doesn't, something has to remove it because it starts to die. It turns to oxidation. And that's a picture in a nature reserve right near our home that we have in New Mexico, where there's nothing there to remove the grass, and it's dying from chemical breakdown, which is very slow, can take 10, 15 years to break down, instead of breaking down biologically. It's killing plants because the sunlight can't reach the growth points, and bare ground is appearing, desertification is occurring. All right, so when this is happening, and it would have happened over many parts of Turkey and so on in the past, what can we do about it? What tools do we have? Well, we have the belief out there, and probably in many of your minds, that we have hundreds of tools we can choose from. Haven't we? We've got thousands of tools. Well, no, we don't. If we break the tools we have down into categories, we find that we've only got technology, fire, or the concept of resting the environment to let it restore. We had our first technology about 1 million years ago. It was just sticks and stones. And we could chip the stones, we could sharpen the sticks, but we couldn't influence our environment. We couldn't do any more than any other tool using animal. Then, somewhere in the last 1 million years or so, we got the tool of fire. Once we had the tool of fire, we could melt the stones and go into the copper, the bronze, the Iron Age, and develop our technology. Look at everything in this room, including the clothing you're wearing. Nothing in this room could be made without fire. Completely rested. It's had masses of money spent on soil conservation measures. It is the site of a failed irrigation-based civilization. And it is desertifying as badly as anything in the world. So the idea of resting the environment just leads to oxidation and death of the plants in these sort of environments. Now, it's not only in sites like that that we find it in research plots. Fortunately, researchers put in plots all over the western United States many years ago, when the government wanted to shoot thousands of sheep to stop the desertification, but they needed data, needed evidence. So they put in plots, stopped animals grazing the grass grew, they photographed it, said there's your evidence, shot 250,000 sheep, and the desert expanded. Thank goodness they left the plots, and we can go and look at the plots, and they too turned to desert. They only looked at the plants regrowing, but then didn't look at how the biological cycle functioned. Looked at it too short term. All right, so we're back with our oxidation problem still. So what other tools could we use to stop desertification and climate change? we can use fire. And that's what humans have done for thousands of years, and that's what humans are still doing. Major environmental organizations, range scientists, etc., burning grasslands to try to keep them healthy and alive. Well, it does remove the top stuff, but it exposes the soil. It puts enormous amounts of black carbon into the air, nitrous oxide, carbon dioxide into the air, and it leads to less effective rainfall or desertification. But it does produce a green flush. Those bases of the plants can now grow, but at a terribly high cost, as the world has learnt. So fire cannot do it, no matter how much it's prescribed or whatever else we call it, it can't do it. So we're back with the problem of oxidation. Now we're only left with one tool, and that is technology. So what technology, even imaginable to you, could restore biological decay, rapid biological decay, every single year on billions of hectares, 2/3 of the world's land? Anybody come up with any technology that could do it? Not possible. I think we can forget that one. Governments have tried. People tried to develop great machines, the Dixon imprinter. Governments spent millions of dollars on them. Today the machines lie rotting, rusting. The desert's just advanced. Now, it's not for lack of trying. When I was in the Negev, I found the Israelis really trying hard. So I'm not criticizing people at all, but they're trying to use technology to plant seedlings. They're spending 10,000 euros per hectare and no chance at all, because that's planting trees. That's not restoring biological decay. So no chance of success there. And when I was in the United Arab Emirates, they again are trying very hard. They've had masses of advice on it. They've spent $30 billion on 1% of the land in the deserts just advancing. Drip irrigation and planting trees. I'm afraid technology can't do it. So we've got a dilemma. No technology in the world is going to save us. Because unless we deal with this, we're not going to deal with climate change, poverty, droughts, floods, all these things on most of the world. Fire can't do it, resting land can't do it, and any amount of planting trees and grass can't do it, as the Chinese are finding. Up to 250,000 tons of sand is dumped on Beijing in some days. And the Chinese are trying to plant trees, it won't do it. So what are we going to do? We've still got the problem of boatloads of people dying, sand being dumped on cities, etc. And we can't be an island unto ourselves today. We're all in this boat together, globally now. Now perhaps you see why in the TED talk that I gave on this, I said we have no option. The only thing available now to us is to turn to animals. And many people resented me as a scientist saying no options, only one thing. That's anathema coming from a scientist. So since getting that criticism, I've put only in capitals and bold, because somebody needs to show us what else could be done. So let's look at animals. These environments that we're talking about, the seasonal rainfall environments, are where prior to humans and agriculture, billions of animals developed with the soil, with the grass, not one before the other. They developed together, totally dependent on one another. Now these billions of animals that developed in those environments had microorganisms in their gut. When the environment went dry, their gut didn't. Microorganisms were there because these animals can't digest the grass. They're doing it in a symbiotic relationship with microorganisms in their gut. Now those masses of animals, they didn't destroy the world because they had pack hunting predators. The pack hunting predators come from those environments. They don't come from the tropical forests. There you get tigers and jaguars that are singular too, because they don't eat insects, and most of the herbivores are insects. In these environments, most of the world, the herbivores are large animals. And those predators tackled anything up to elephants. Now, how did those animals protect themselves from predation? Not a numbers issue. So if we can keep the animals moving and get the timing right, it doesn't matter whether you've got 100 or 1,000,000. That's only going to change the number of plants bitten, not going to change the fact of overgrazing. Okay, so we've got some good science there, we've got some logic and common sense. Now you see why I say only one option. Now today we can't turn to that wildlife because most of it is so disrupted. In even the areas where I live, most of the time, with the lions and the cheetahs and the hyenas and all these things, their numbers are too low. And there's too much interference with railway lines and fences and roads and so on for the free movement of the animals. So now, being practical, and with 10 billion people we're going to have to feed, why not use livestock? Why not use an animal to mimic an animal, instead of technology to try and mimic an animal? It makes sense. All right, so if we do that, let's see what then happens. Here we've got that grassland we were looking at, and we'll simulate in the foreground with large herd of animals. So now you see what's happened. Bringing a large herd of animals in there for a very short time has got all of that vegetation down on the soil as dung, urine or litter, dead plant material trampled. That soil, you cannot see bare ground. You can't even put your finger on bare ground now. Between the plants, it's covered. Now any rain falling on that is going to soak in. It can't run across the land easily. It's held up all the way by vegetation, litter. Now any water soaking in there now is going to go to a river flow, underground water, or when these start to grow, it will come out of the plants. And now they're beginning to grow, and it's coming out of the plants. That's effective rainfall using animals. And that now looks like that, fully recovered in the next growing season. Now if we hadn't done that, this would be grey and starting to die. All right, I think there's a... No, we'll go on a little further and then I'll give you a break. So when we look at this desertification problem, it occurred to me way back in the 1960s that we had no option but to use livestock. Now, how were we going to do it? It's one thing to say use livestock as a tool, but how? People have been running livestock for over 10,000 years. Extremely knowledgeable, more knowledgeable than any of us in this room. These animals were their entire culture. They knew their connection to the land, their relationship to the land better than we do. And they created the great man-made deserts. So herding the animals wasn't going to do it. They'd been herding and moving continually, but obviously getting something wrong. Then we'd had 100 years of modern range science, pasture systems, fencing, etc. Now that seemed to work in the humid areas of the world, in Europe, etc. But Voisin, the Frenchman in his work, found that those rotational and other grazing systems weren't working. What he found was we needed to replace them with some way, some planning process, some way of continuous process rather than any prescribed rotation or system of any sort. All right, so looking at that situation, I first did the logical thing. Don't reinvent the wheel. Take Voisin's work, I believe he's correct. Tried that in the drier areas, the more seasonal areas, with more complexity of wildlife and crops and not just pastures, and fell on my face. Too many mistakes. It wasn't working. So at that point I thought, all right, Voisin is right. He's not wrong. It's just that we've got more complexity in these more seasonal environments than France. So what are we going to do? And at that point, really, rather than, again, reinvent the wheel, I just started looking at all businesses, saying somebody out there must have dealt with something very complicated, must have techniques, planning processes. Looked at Harvard Business School, whatever you like. And the logical one to turn to was the military. And I thought, well, nobody's had to deal with more complicated situations than armies. And they've had hundreds of years in Europe of fighting battles and learning that you don't fight in squares with the infantry, artillery on your left and cavalry on your right and infantry in squares. You get a hiding. You've got to have a planning process. You've got to have something much more capable of dealing with a fluid situation. So they had worked out over centuries a very simple planning process, extremely simple, that you could train people at times of war rapidly to do just immediate battlefield planning. So I just took Britain's Sandhurst immediate battlefield training and said, why do anything else? Let's just do that. And took that very simple procedure, and then all we had to do was to put it on a chart. Sorry, I got this. All we had to do was to put it on a chart, because we could express a year or 6 months or 2 years, depending on what we were planning. We could put areas of land down one side, we could put behavior animals, we could put numbers and calculations around the edge, we could put problems in with symbols to represent the problems, whatever we've got. When are we cropping? When aren't we cropping? When can animals come onto the crop fields? When should they be off them? We can do all of that on a chart easily, one little step at a time. Even a child can do it literally. We train illiterate people to do it in no time at all. So we can do it from a sophisticated farm level to a very simple level, and lo and behold, that worked. We got that in the late 60s, and it works consistently. So all we needed was some planning process and the idea of bringing in another tool. So go back to our decision-making, genetic way we do it. It was simply not possible to deal with large areas of the world, about 2/3 of the world, because technology can't, fire can't, resting the land can't. We have no option but to open our minds, stop vilifying livestock, get them out of feedlots, factory settings where they're environmentally unsound, economically unsound, unsound for human health reasons. There's no reason to have them there at all. Get them back on the land, managed properly, and we can begin to address droughts, floods, poverty, feeding people over billions of acres of the land. Now I want to give you a brief break to stand up, relax, and then we'll carry on. Carry on, I think we've got the folks we need back here. Now I want to change gears. The word holistic is in there. Up until the break, I was talking to you about the desertification part of this global situation we're facing of rising poverty, droughts, floods, etc. Agriculture producing more damaged, eroding soil than food. It's one big problem that I'm referring to there, agriculture being our greatest danger. Even if we discover alternatives to fossil fuels, which we have to do, and we can only do that with technology in some form, it's highly likely climate change will continue because of agriculture. So, in my mind, it's the most dangerous thing we have is agriculture. And particularly when it had caused the failure of so many civilizations before we discovered fossil fuels. Remember, all those past civilizations were nothing but organic, sustainable so-called. So even organic agriculture is not going to save us unless we now look deeper into this problem. Now, when we developed this planning process for the grazing, we got immediate, very encouraging successes. Taking even bare ground that was said by range scientists to be technically beyond reclamation, we brought it back to knee-high perennial grass, only using animals, nothing else. No seeding, nothing, just handling the animals properly, getting it coming back. Now, in that situation, we seem to be on our way. But then we started to get erratic results. So some of them had been successful about 4 years or so, starting to fail, get erratic. Investigating those to find out why, we found the problem wasn't in the grazing planning. That we have never had a problem with. It has hundreds of years of experience behind it. It works. And it works every time. Now, so the erratic results were coming from other issues, social, cultural, economic, that we hadn't brought into that full complexity, just like those past civilizations. There was nothing wrong with their organic agriculture. They could not handle the complexity, social, environmental, rising population, and deteriorating land. So we had to, in effect, go back to the drawing board and try to understand what was going wrong, how could we get consistent results. Very early in my life, I became fed up with endless meetings, endless discussions about what we should do and about the problem. I was looking for solutions and would find myself just getting weary of conferences and things talking about what we should do but not how to do it. We didn't know how to do things, so I was trying to find a simple way. Now, let's go into that and have a look at it. I want you to look at that list and see what those things have in common. There's a list of things there, and as you look at it, I think you'll realize everything there requires technology. Everything there requires experts. I don't even know how to make a watch. It's too complicated for my little mind. I can't even make a shirt. I'm not expert enough. And everything there is essentially being successful and getting more and more successful. Smaller and smaller phones, whatever you have, you name it. We're going further and further into space. Amazing successes from our technology and our expertise. Now, what do you see in common in that list? Nothing there involves expertise. Nothing there is made. Everything on the left we make. Nothing on the right do we make. Everything on the right we manage. Everything on the left is getting more and more successful. Everything on the right, if we're honest with ourselves, we're running into deeper and deeper trouble. So the problem lies not with what we make, but what we manage. What else is different in these lists? Everything on the left is complicated. Nothing is self-renewing. If we have a computer or something, it can be incredibly complicated, but it's not self-renewing. If a part is missing, if it hasn't got any power, it stops working. If I've got a watch and a part breaks, it doesn't work. It can't organize itself. And everything on the left does what it's designed to do. It doesn't do something else that we didn't expect. Now, when we look at everything on the right, we find everything is complex. It is self-organizing. When the chairperson of an organization dies, the organization doesn't die. You change, you put another person in there. If we lose a species of plant in the forest, it doesn't die. The forest carries on in changed form. If we lose a species of fish in the ocean doesn't die, all life doesn't die, it changes and it carries on in a changed form. So everything on the right is what by definition is complex, self-organizing. Now, the things on the right, particularly where they are human organizations, do what they're designed to do. And they do it very efficiently. But because they are complex, they also have unplanned, what they call emergent properties. So they can be very, very efficient, but there'll be unplanned problems with them because of complexity. An example of that would be organizations can be extremely efficient at pushing the latest technology. Go into any organization, university, farming organization, whatever, and they will have the latest technology, the latest software, the latest computers. But an emergent property is that it's extremely difficult, almost impossible, to get new knowledge into an organization. If it's counterintuitive, paradigm shifting, new knowledge, organizations cannot adopt it. You can study that throughout history. They can only adopt it when the population at large shifts. When the opinion of population shifts, then the organizations can adopt new thinking. They will normally lead the opposition and resistance to new thinking. That's an unplanned property because of complexity. Okay, so everything on the right is complex, and there lies our problem. Everything on the left and the right, we use the same decision-making embedded genetic process. Everything on the right, we have objectives. When we're managing, we're going to use tools, technology, fire, or arresting the environment. The only other tool we've ever had is small living organisms to make cheese and wine, and now genetically engineer species, but not to manage our environment at large. So everything on the right or the left will use the same tools, and everything on the right or the left, we will make the decisions in the same way. Research results, expert opinion, cash flow, cost, political expediency, compromise, whatever. So we use exactly the same genetically embedded way, and it's highly successful on the left, not so successful on the right. Why? So looking into that why, we find that the problem starts with objectives. That's where it is. So everything we do on the left or the right, we have an objective. Now, an objective needs a context. Let me give you an example. Has anybody got some matches or a cigarette lighter? I'm going to light a fire. That's my objective. Should I? Should I light a fire? You see, you're immediately hesitant. Why? You're hesitant because you don't know the reason, the context, the circumstances. Every objective has to have a context. If it doesn't have a context, it leads to unexpected results. So if I was to light a fire here, I'd probably burn the building down. But if it was very cold, the heating had packed up and there was a fireplace here, it would make sense. And so it is with every objective in your life. It needs a context. Do we ever think about that? Do any of you think about the context for your objectives? You don't tend to. They're so automatic. So when you think about the context for our objectives, it's nearly always need. There's a river to cross. We're going to build a bridge. Objective, build a bridge. What's the context? We can't cross the river. When we do this on the left, it's not a big deal. When we do it on the right, it becomes a big deal with unexpected consequences. And so great is that problem that in the humanities and some sciences, we talk about the law of unintended consequences. Just to remind us to be a bit more humble, because the world is so complex. And we are seeing these unintended consequences over and over again to the point that we're using the word law. All right, so when we look at the context for our actions today in management or in making anything, it is need, desire, profit, or we're addressing a problem. And it's nearly always those four. There are others, but those four predominate. So I bought this shirt because I needed it, or I desired a shirt. When we look at governments, policies, and development projects that are very critical to our survival, what do you think the context is of every government policy in Turkey? Nobody even asks. And you would feel foolish to ask, because it's so obvious. It's the problem being addressed. I didn't realize until I was president of a political party, sitting with my shadow, war we were fighting, everything else, economy. It wasn't until that point that it suddenly hit me, not just there, but throughout my body, that, oh my goodness, this is what governments do. This is the only thing they do, is develop policies from which you base laws and regulations. And every single policy, without exception, I believe, if you look at the context, it's the problem. We've got a drugs policy because kids are taking too many drugs. What are the unintended consequences? If you take the United States, they've got a drug policy with many objectives. The context is people taking too many drugs. What are the unintended consequences of that? Drug use has increased, and they've got more people in jail than Stalin had at the height of his reign. And the violence is extending to other countries, now to North Africa, not just the Americas. Unintended consequences of an action, a policy. All right, so that is happening simply because the context is so simple that it can't deal with the complexity. On the left, you're not dealing with complexity, so it's okay to build a bridge or whatever it is. On the right, if you think of it, even in your home, just think of it in your home. If you have an objective in your home, or you develop a policy in your home for the kids watching television, whatever it is, it's almost impossible to think of any objective that doesn't have social, cultural consequences, implications, environmental implications, and economic implications. And these simple contexts in our lives, in our governments, are where the problem lies. I believe it is that simple. It's not thousands of things out there causing our problems. We're causing them. Right in our homes, in our communities, in our governments, etc. So what we do when managing holistically is we just acknowledge that. And you can manage holistically at any level. You can manage holistically in the home, on the farm, pastoralists, government, anywhere, any level. Just as we are managing at any level today with the genetically embedded framework we use. And all we do now, when managing holistically, is to use a couple of modifications to that frame. Slight modifications that suddenly make it more successful. It is that simple. And what we also add to that, not only is having a context that is socially, environmentally sound, but we add 10 little filter questions to help our minds make our decisions be socially, environmentally, economically sound, short and long term. Because with our minds, it's very difficult to think of three things even in one dimension. In this room, with all of you, if I was to ride, get people to ride past on bicycles, how many of you could count them as they rode past? I think you all could. I know I could. If I got people to ride by on bicycles and some on motorbikes, and you had to count 2 columns as they went past you, how many could count them in your minds? Maybe a few. I begin to fall out at that point. If I bring them past on bicycles, motorbikes and cars, and ask you to count all the cars, all the bikes, all the motorbikes that pass you, hold up your hands, the liars, who could do it. I've met one man in my life that could do that. And yet we're making decisions every day that need to be socially, environmentally and economically in our own self-interest. We can't do it. We stopped doing it way back when we got far in advance of technology. That's why our problem is so ancient. So now, there is the genetic way all of us are doing everything. at every level, from our homes to government, to international affairs. And I would defy anybody to find any situation where we're not doing that. It is absolutely embedded in us. Now, when we look at that, we see that the context was too simple for complexity. It was okay on the left, remember, not okay on the right. The context was always too simple, too mechanistic. That's why I call our management of today reductionist, because we reduced the context to simplicity. So we faced a context that was real out there, of social, cultural, environmental, etc., and we always reduced it to need, desire, or problem being addressed. We reduced it to that. So there was a major part of the problem, and there was another part. There was a tool missing to cover about 2/3 of the world that is largely grasslands, former grasslands, savannas, etc. Very seasonal in rainfall. That's it. Correct those two things and everything begins to come right. Because most people are good. We've got incredible knowledge in our universities, on our farms, our ranches, businesses, etc. It's mind-boggling. The last IFOAM conference that I addressed in Germany, I mingled with people throughout that conference, people from many countries. I listened to the many papers given, talks given, and I was in awe of how much knowledge was in that room. But when we went out on the land, and I saw practices that were very bad, damaging Germany, etc., everybody I spoke to, and I said, why are you doing this? It is so bad. I got the same reply time and again. By law we have to. By regulation we have to. In other words, policies were forcing it. Even though the knowledge was there. So we have this enormous amount of knowledge. If we can just start to modify that and do it slightly differently. So all we do now is use a holistic framework, slight modification at any level. And in that, as you know, we add livestock as a tool properly managed. Get them out of factory feedlots, industrial production, etc. When you think about agriculture, and I think it'll make sense to all of you, agriculture should be based on the biological sciences. Period. Roughly, maybe 3 to 5, 6%, maybe a bit more, is based on the biological sciences. Essentially, that's folks like you in the room, folks that are coming to a conference like IFOAM. 90+% of agriculture in the world, what is it based on? Not on the biological sciences. It's based on chemistry, and it's based on smart marketing use of technology. How can we advance technology to make more profit? Objective profit, using technology and chemistry. We're doomed if we don't get agriculture based on biological sciences. And when we do that, it's going to be absolutely essential to use livestock on the grasslands of the world and on the crop fields of the world as well in many, many instances. Now, the other thing we need to do is to have a holistic context for our objectives. And that is a simple thing that people do in the family, on the farm, in the community, at a government level, national level. We do it at any of these levels, train people how to do it, and it simply is defining how we want our lives to be. Everything's about how we want our lives to be. So we define it depending on our culture, our values, whatever they are. And then what do we have to produce from our environment to live lives like that? And what does our environment have to look like 500 years from now for our descendants to be living a life like that? That's it. And you cannot have any prejudice against a future action. You don't prioritize anything. There are a few simple rules to defining the context for your lives. Then you start to make all management objectives towards that. And lo and behold, it's different. Okay, so let's look at a typical context. I'll give you a moment to read that. And if somebody's interpreting, please read. I'm not listening to the... That's been my experience in any country I work in. That is a general holistic context that I use, have in my mind when I'm visiting a new country or reading policies, reading the newspaper, listening to the news. I'm just relating things to that and saying, well, what's happening here? What's the context for that action? And I'm relating it to this. And time again I can see that's going wrong, that's going to go wrong. Because this should be the sort of thing we're taking action and managing towards, as a simple context like that. Now, does it work to do things like this? Yes, on farms, ranches, with pastoralists, etc. At that level, on the ground, with people. We've been doing this now for 40 years, more, 50 years, more than that. Some of the families I've helped with the desert problem, desertification in Africa, I'm now dealing with third generation on the same farm. So we've been doing this for a long time, and consistently it works. And I'll show you some results just now. All right, so on the farms, the ranches, etc., doesn't matter what it is, once we begin to manage holistically with our organic agriculture and our crops and everything else, but just making decisions holistically, lo and behold, that works. Now, what about at a higher level of policy? If we're going to succeed in dealing with our problem globally that we have, we're going to have to do it at two levels. One is people like us on the ground making actions, decisions in our families, on our farms, and making those management decisions in our own self-interest, enlightened self-interest in that manner. And the other is we need policies from above that support that empower us to do that. What is happening, just like the case I mentioned a moment ago that I found in Germany, I find it all over, I find it in my own country of Zimbabwe, I find it in America, is where people are trying to do the right thing on the ground, they're often forced to do the wrong thing by laws, regulations, policies coming from above. So we need also to be getting these policies up there. Now, the only way we're going to do that in real is when public opinion changes, because institutions have known about this for 35 years. But they cannot do it till public opinion changes. Till your opinion changes and you speak to more and more and more people, and when enough people are saying it makes sense that all policies should be developed holistically, only then will our governments, universities, organizations be able to do so. They cannot run ahead of public opinion. And that you'll see from Galileo to Ignaz Semmelweis, the Hungarian doctor that discovered bacteria before we knew it, everything. They cannot do it till you are insisting. But we have been able to test the idea with them. We have been able to work with people in government agencies and run workshops, prolonged workshops, seeing what is possible when public opinion changes. Now, the first place we did that on a big scale was the United States. The USDA, US Department of Agriculture, shortly after I went to America, knowing about this work, engaged me over a 2-year period to put 2,000 officials through training. They came from all the land management agencies, the universities, the agricultural universities, from the World Bank, USAID, etc. 2,000 is a big sample. And those people came to a training on using the holistic framework, a week-long training to analyze policies, etc. They came in batches of about 30 at a time, and we went through that training. Now, in all of that training, we got them to bring their own policies, mostly in agriculture, around noxious weeds, problems like that, droughts, floods, failing small towns with the World Bank, all these sort of things. Now, every single policy they brought, they analyzed with the holistic framework, and they could not find a single policy, not one, in the hundreds that we looked at over 2 years, that would meet its objectives, was not dealing with symptoms, they were all dealing with symptoms in addressing a problem, and that would not lead to unintended consequences. And if you read the textbook on holistic management, to me the most significant sentence in it is where one group of about 30 got into a pretty good discussion about that and eventually came to a unanimous conclusion that we wrote down, and it's in the textbook. And that conclusion they came to was, they said, we now recognize that unsound resource management is universal in the United States. Do you think it's any different in Turkey? It's the same everywhere. And nobody is to blame. Nobody was being wrong, evil. We just didn't know we were using a flawed, basic, underlying framework. We did the same thing in India with Forest Service. They looked at 12 of their policies, their own policies. They concluded those policies, if carried out, would damage their forests, damage India, damage the communities, damage their economy. In all those cases, nothing changed. It could not change because we were too early. Public opinion wasn't even beginning to hear about the idea of managing holistically in anything. So we were too early with it. Right, where do we go from here? One of the things that's perturbing me a great deal now, and I'd like to talk to you about it, we see it at all levels. We see it in agriculture, we see it in trying to save species. We see people getting together in organizations, and each organization believes they have the answer. There isn't a the answer, but they fervently believe it. And so each organization uses the media, competes with other organizations to get funding, and we compete with each other. We see that in mainstream agriculture as one group, and then we've got those of us, like in this room, working in organic, sustainable, regenerative agriculture, having our way. I see it with trying to save rhino and elephant, animals that are very dear to me, having grown up with them, living with them. You've got organizations, right now they're planning a march to save rhino. You've got different organizations competing for funds, validity of their idea. No hope, because all of them have an objective. And what is the context? The problem. Rhino are being poached. Same as in agriculture. We've all got our objectives. What is the context? It's the problem of failing agriculture. That's too simple a context. So what are we going to do about that? The moment we manage holistically, those ideas become valid. Now we can sit with those ideas from all those organizations and look at them in context, holistic context of how people want their lives to be, etc. The moment we do that, we'll have no problem saving rhino. We'll have no problem beginning to put our agriculture right. But I believe we'll have a considerable problem if we keep doing what we're doing today. With those of us in, let's say, regenerative agriculture, just using one word to cover it, we have our ideas, our organizations. We aren't even at the policy table. Governments aren't even considering us. Because 90-something% of agriculture is chemical industrial. Smart use of technology. They're the guys driving policy. Governments listen to the majority. We're a very minority. It's a David and Goliath struggle. Now, the moment we can all start saying policies need to be holistic, neither side, nobody can argue that point. Nobody can argue for policies to be reductionist. If we can get one point of agreement like that and bring that about, suddenly we will be at the table equals. And the thinking of regenerative agriculture will be coming into policies. So I really hope we can bring that about quickly to get us at the table, because there's no question agriculture needs to be based on the biological sciences, as we are trying to do. Picking it off, putting things in the trolley, got to the checkout counter. There were about 6 people in front of her, so she had to wait. While she was waiting with her son, she looked at her list and suddenly thought of the context of her life. And looked at the list, and it was need, desire. When she thought of it, and she said she went back and put half the things back on the shelf. Didn't need them. That's it. It's that simple. She suddenly realized, no, education of her son, many things were more important than the stuff she was just picking up because of need or desire. In dimension, we use 10 filters, and I've tried to think of a local example to use, and I'll use this board, although I think some of you in the far corner may not see this. You'll just have to listen. Can wheel it up a little bit more? That'll help a little bit. Listening to folks here, one of the issues you have, and we have this in many places, is land units dividing up too small. Now, let's say that a group of us here had small farms. We've got a bit of grazing land, we've got a bit of crop land, we've got a home on it, and we were to begin to manage holistically. Now, we've got a couple of possibilities. One of the problems with our grazing land, which we've got a bit of on each of our farms, is that there's a very different relationship of the land, the soil, the plants to the size of the herds. If we can get more animals together, we find land recovers quicker than with few animals. Right? So if we could get more animals together, we could improve our land. If we could get more animals together, we could fertilize our fields much faster, because more animals puts more dung and urine on the fields. But we've all got small farms. So at the moment, we go on with our small farms, and we have our objectives and so on. Now, if we were all, let's say it was us in this room, to have these small farms, but to all begin to manage holistically in our own enlightened self-interest, and let's say we had a context something like that, and it's very doubtful anybody will vary much from it, so we could agree on the context for our lives, then we would look at these possibilities. And I'll try and do it for you here through the filtering. What we would do is, let's say we are at the moment relatively poor, relatively low production. That's our situation. Let's say we now have a holistic context that we're going to use. Now, when we do this filtering, often you'll just do it common sense, but if it's a difficult situation or there's a group and you want to all be in harmony on it, we'll come through the filters. And the first one we will ask is cause and effect. And we'll look first at maintaining our single farms as we are, because what we're doing now is saying ownership matters more than anything to us. But ownership isn't in the context. When my wife and I did this with the last ranch I had remaining after our war in Zimbabwe, ownership didn't confuse it. What I valued, particularly in my life, having lived there all my life, was living on the land, living with wildlife, living with people. That's what I valued. And when I did this, I realized the only way I could save that was to give the land away. Because I didn't confuse ownership and management in the context. Right? So now, if we look at this and we keep owning, we can quickly see that we won't deal with the cause of our problem, which is the small land units. So we're not making the decision yet, we're just saying, don't like that. And then we would look at social. If we were to keep our single farms, would we cause any conflict in the area? No, because one of the things we do when managing holistically is we do everything we can to avoid conflicts beginning. I'm sure you all know this, that it's very easy to start a conflict. Have you ever tried to end them? Extremely difficult to end them. So one of the filters when you're managing holistically is to ask this socially, would we start a conflict if we kept our farms? No, we're okay there, we won't start a conflict. Because everybody's got them, everybody believes in this at the moment. And then the next thing we'd look at is biological. Are we dealing with a problem organism? No, we're not. So we just bypass that, bypass it. We only bring that in if we're dealing with a rare and endangered species or a noxious plant, there's too many of them, we bring that one in. Now the next thing we look here is the financial chain of production. There's three links in any business. Human creativity and raw resources are converted to a product in some form, and then that's marketed, and then we have $1 in any business. And we just say, if we took this action, are we addressing any one of these links? And the answer is no, we're not. We're still back with the problem of small farms. So you could say, I'm unsure, or you could say no. It doesn't matter, you're not making your mind up at this point. You're just going through some filters to get a better feel for this whole situation. And then the next one we'd look at is what is the energy, source and pattern of use. Because most decisions involve energy, we're not involving any particular energy, so we'd bypass it. And then we'd look at the dollars, the money, source and pattern of use. Most actions require dollars. This, we're not looking at any particular dollars, so just bypass it. It's purely going through this quickly. We then look at gross margin analysis. Well, we're not selling our farms, so we'd bypass it. This is where you're looking at, should we be producing potatoes or chickens, pigs or cattle, sheep or goats. This is when you're looking at different enterprises to run the farm or the business. And the next thing we'd look at is sustainability. Now, going towards the context we have there, is this, if we take this action, is it leading generally in that direction of prosperity for everybody and stable environment? No, not too happy with that. Now these are what did you think, what did you think, what did you think? Now we come to the last one, society and culture, we just call it, and now what do you feel? The final decision is how do you feel? Because you're looking at such complexity, it comes down to feelings. And at this point, if it was me, I'd be saying, not too happy with that, let's look at the alternative. So now if we looked at the alternative, which is all of us retaining ownership, so we own our farms, we have our homes on them, we have our crop fields on them, but our farms, we bring them together for management of the livestock. Because we're going to need it on our crop fields, we're going to need it elsewhere, we're just looking at that at the moment. So how would that involve? Again, being all of our land together, we'd have to settle on the type of animals we run, we'd have to agree on that, and not say, no, I'm determined on goats and I'm determined. We'd test those ideas, something that's going to be in context like this. We agree on the type of animal that would be suitable, etc., and that we could go with. Then we start going through this again. Now, would we deal with the problem? Yes, we would. Would that cause a problem? No, we'd be happy there, society. Biological, we're not dealing with that. This one, now, we're more sure of it. We're going to increase everybody's prosperity. Now, when we come to the energy and the pattern of use, we can just say bypass, we're not looking at particular energy. This one, dollars and source and pattern of use, you can, I would be inclined, just because of experience, to put a click in there, because I'm also seeing alternative uses. You can talk about this as you go, but I'm realizing if we put our farms together like this for management, then it doesn't take all of us to manage a few animals every day. While they're on my land, I manage them. When they move on to someone else's, they're managing it, or however we organize it. But it takes very few of us to manage that large herd of ours as it moves across our farms, comes onto our crop fields. It only takes organization. So most of us could have much of the year with free time to do another job, anything we want to do. So it's going to free up a lot of time. So I'm seeing it that pretty favorably there. We're not selling the farms. Now, is this in line with the future land that we envision far into the future? Yes. Now, how do I feel about this? I'd probably be saying, yeah, that's it. I feel good about that. It's just a quick thing to give you an idea of how the filtering works. And we can do that at any level, policies, anything. It's essentially the same, 10 filters we go through to help our minds just make the decision socially, culturally, environmentally, economically, in our own self-interest, in context. Coming on us, and coming on in many of your lives. I'm in the departure lounge at my age. Many of you younger folks are going to have to face this. So where's the leadership going to come from? It can only come from you. There is nowhere else it can come from. So facing that reality and having tried many things, what we're doing through our small institute is encouraging people in all countries of the world to develop locally led, locally managed hubs where people can be learning together, collaborating, training in their own language, in their own culture, in their own countries. Now, some countries, Mexico's already got 4 hubs going, already beginning to influence government. Thankfully, thanks to you guys, Turkey's got a hub started. Now, what we're doing is those hubs are forming around the world. We had a conference recently in London. There were, I believe, 25 countries represented at that, forming hubs like this. And what we're doing from our little center, and we can do that today, thanks to internet and technology, is we're linking all the hubs so they can help each other, support each other, pass knowledge quickly between countries, and already that's happening. After, I mean, you guys are already in touch with people in Sweden. I've seen them in touch with the people in Chile and Argentina. So it's happening already. We can pass knowledge quickly, experience quickly. Having these hubs in each country where people from our universities, our government agencies, our environmental organizations, farming organizations, NGOs, can just have an area of agricultural land where they're collaborating, learning together. None of us knows the answers, but we've found a way to begin to work them out. There isn't a the answer, a the solution, but there is now a way to begin to work it out and use the science, use the knowledge that we have. So I'd like to encourage all of you to get involved in that, and particularly if we're serious about the future, we've got to stop preaching to the choir. Like today, I'm preaching to the choir. All of you probably think similarly. What about the millions of people out there that we're not reaching? They control policy. They control your future. And that's now city people. All of the economic power, voting power, everything has gone to the cities now. And there's such a detachment from our food, from our agricultural base, that we have to stop speaking to the choir and getting out to more and more and more people so that policies can change. And I'm glad that you have started that. I'd just like to end by encouraging you to get involved. I'm often asked, I've had a hard life. I don't regret any of it. I became very obsessed with solving problems when I was very young. I wouldn't have admitted it in those days. I don't mind today. I sat and cried. I sat on the banks of a river in my country, coming down mud, trees tumbling down in the flood, and I just cried and cried. I couldn't see the sense of being in the army, being prepared to give my life, defending my country, while that was happening. I was aware that that destroys nations more than armies ever do. And if I was prepared to fight for causes and politicians and things, wasn't I prepared to do something about that? And I became very determined just to find solutions, work with anybody I could who was constructive and looking for solutions, get out of this trap of endless discussion of the problems, right? Now, I've often been asked, why did I do that so obsessively, despite all the opposition? Because I've had enormous opposition that I don't want to go through. It's happened to everybody in history. Nobody's being bad. It's just how we are, all right? And I bring it down to one word, care. If you care enough, you'll do whatever it takes, whatever it takes. So particularly here, I'm talking to the younger folks here. If you care enough, you will change the whole of Turkey. Believe me, I know you can, because I know what impact I've been able to have globally through just caring enough. Once you care enough, nothing will stop you, and things will change. Thank you.
Yani ben bu yöntemin pratik ve işleyişiyle ilgili bir şeyler duymak istediğimi belirtmek isterim sadece. Yani çeşitli deneyimler olmuş anladığım kadarıyla. Bunların nasıl işlediği ve sonuçlarının ne olduğu konusunda bizi aydınlatabilir mi?
Soruları teker teker alacağız.
Okay, some results on land. Now these are dealing where we've done the longest, dealing with the desertification problem. There is an example in the Karoo Desert. Right, this was about 10 kilometers of road, and if you look on the left, it is relatively dry. On the right, it is very green. Now the rain didn't stop for 10 kilometers along the road. All that's happened on the left, the animals are on some rotational grazing system. On the right, they're on holistic planned grazing. And there for 10 kilometers, you've got the rain being more effective. On the right, everything greening up. On the left, it's still dry. That's one example in that sort of country. Here's another one. This land had been bare and eroding no matter what rain. If we got twice the annual rainfall, it still stayed bare. And that was bare year after year after year. It's on the road to my old home. I used to watch it often. Now, on that land, we've done no reseeding, no use of technology, nothing. Just changed the animal behavior, the herding, and we also put them in predator-friendly enclosures that can be moved at night. And that same land, see the trees, 2 trees on the right? There's the same land now. Now it's coming back to grassland by just changing the animal movement behavior. Nothing more. Here's another example. You could see the tree with the damaged bark there, largely bare ground and annual grasses. And then the same thing, we've just changed the animal behavior, crowded them onto that land, dunging, urinating, trampling, etc. And there's the same land changed. That's the same tree there in the middle. And this just goes on and on. On this land, which is land I live on in Africa, these particularly bad sites, we tend to put the animals at night for about a week on one spot. So every night for about a week they're on it at night, and while they're grazing during the day, and then we move that site to the worst where we've got a gully or very bare ground, and we must have now done over 500 sites. And every site gets better. No site has ever got worse. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, sort of. But I don't know if this is a place to discuss this, but...
And you just take whatever animals are there and you decide how many months you're planning for. Are you planning for the growing season when you'll get more and more vegetation? Or are you at the end of it planning for the dormant season when you'll get less and less? And then you put down the areas of land that you have and the size, and then you come through this looking at when will animals be calving or lambing or kidding if they're goats, and you mark those times in just with colour pencils, and then you come through each piece of land saying what problems are there, what do I need to be aware of, oh this piece has got cropland in, when are the crops in, and animals must be kept out of the crop field. And you just put a line through that one so it's not available. And when will there be water or no water? Are there poisonous plants? When are they poisonous? All these things are just put on the chart. And then you say, with these areas of land, when the animals come in to graze anywhere, they're going to bite a plant severely on the first day. So if that happens, how long would that plant need in this area? Well, most of the world, it's at least a month to 2 months. So it's 30 to 60, maybe 90 days, unless you're trying to do something else on that land. So that tells you how long recovery must be. Then we work out, if we've got this many pieces of land available, how long will they stay on average? You see, each of these is just a simple step. And then you say, well, these areas of land, some are big, some are small, some are hills, some are valleys, so they're different. And so you rate them, which is the best, and how do others compare with it. And then you take a simple arithmetic, and you work out a planned period to stay in each paddock, and that goes in some figures over on the right on the chart. And now you're ready to plot the grazing, and you plot where the animals are going to go. Now, with rotational grazing, you always go forwards. So from here they'll go to there, from there they'll go to there. Now when we plan grazing, we've got a big advantage. We can go backwards. So we can say we want them in November over there because they'll be lambing or kidding or whatever it is. So let's book that grazing. Now how did we get them there? Well, they came from here. Well, from here, where did they come from? And we can plan backwards. So we can plan backwards or forwards. It's just done with pencil. And then you can see how the animals are going to move. So to get the animals in the right place, for the right reason, with the right behavior, at the right time. It's just planned on a chart. It's like playing a game of backgammon or something. It's fun. And an average big ranch, that's about 2 hours of work twice a year. You imagine. And the aid memoir, that list that people follow in the planning, is one for the world. And every mistake we've made in any country, this has been practiced on 6 continents now, and every mistake we've ever made has changed the planning. So you just use that planning, and if you've got a new problem that we've never struck, the planning will change for everyone. It's just like the military. They have one aid memoir for every immediate battlefield condition. Do you see it? It's one. And this is the same. So all of these problems we've struck are in there. Now, if you have too many animals, we detect it very quickly from the planning. It's a little difficult to explain here, but we can very quickly work out if animals are coming into this area, how many animals, how many hectares, how many days. So we can work out animal days per hectare, so we can work out square meters needed for one animal a day to feed it. And we can go and look at that land and say, sample areas like that and say, would that feed one animal one day? If it wouldn't, you've got too many animals. Now we know it months ahead in case we need to reduce. And then we reduce very slightly. So people doing this planning through terrible droughts in Africa, etc., have very, very seldom needed to decrease animals. And when they do, it's very slight and 6 months ahead of anybody else. And if accidentally you carry too many animals and you keep to this planning process, the land gets better, but the animals get thinner. The old way we practiced, the animals got better and the land got damaged. This way reverses it. The land gets better if you're running too many animals, but your animals will get thinner. That sounds a fairly common problem. The first thing is, you've got into that situation through making decisions the old way. The way out of that situation is making decisions holistically. That doesn't mean it'll be easy or sudden, but you'll get out of it, the situation step by step, by testing each of those ideas, filtering each of the ideas. When you say not possible to run that many animals on the land, we don't know at the moment how many animals can be run on the land. What we're learning, and our learning site in Zimbabwe, which is the oldest one we have, is that we have no idea what the productivity of the land is. When we began there, the rancher from whom I bought that land long ago was going broke. He could only run about 100 head of cattle. We have put it right by going up 400%. Now the rain is more effective. We're growing much more grass. Life makes life. It's all accelerating. Right now, we have really heavy need to increase and almost double the animals again, just to keep pace with the production of the land. So we don't know how productive these grasslands are because they have been wrongly handled for so many thousands of years now. All right? So I would just encourage you to start making the decisions holistically and starting to get more and more production off the land. The more you have to get the production of grain or anything bought, the less economic it's going to be. And grain and anything bought, I think we can guarantee is going to go up and up and up in price. It's not going to come down. So costs of running business are going to get heavier and heavier. So even, and I'm not saying this as advice, even if you had to reduce animals but produce far more profitably, that would be worth considering. Now, There are other things here that I've not had time to go through. When we do financial planning on the farm with holistic management, all right, we use 2 or 3 new psychological things that greatly increase the profitability of farms. There is a study by Deb Steiner, Dr. Steiner and co-workers at Ohio State University. She studied early adopters of holistic management across the United States, from Florida to California. And what she found was those early adopters averaged 300% more profit. Now, in the same years, in the same markets that those farmers were operating, 600,000 American farm families went bankrupt. And suicide was the leading cause of death in agriculture. So it was interesting, that sample of early adopters beginning to make decisions holistically, plan that way holistically, average 300% more profit. So I can only encourage you to get started. And you won't take any risk, because each decision you'll be weighing it up in your context. So it will be risk-free and slow but steady change. That's about all I can say to you at the moment. That are raising the sheep to plan in vineyards with their wineries. We've got people doing it in orchards, under the trees, it doesn't matter. And we had one excellent example in Mexico where they were doing it in the forest. No open grasslands, but just forage and odd clearings. And that was very exciting, because their herd was herded every day from the village into the forest. And there they had horses, sheep, pigs, goats and cattle, all running together in one herd in the forest. Pigs rooting up, other animals following them, all to plan. Very, very beautiful to watch. And the only problem they reported was when the lambs were dropping, or the kids were dropping, they had to take the pigs out. Otherwise the pigs would kill them at that point, when they're very, very young. Other than that, no problem. So yes, absolutely, in orchards anywhere. There isn't a situation I can even picture in the world where you couldn't be managing holistically. There's no situation. Everything in management in the end needs to have a context.
Teşekkürler. Seki senden alalım soruyu hemen yanda.
Ben de aynı soruya devam olarak sorayım. Hemen hemen her yerde olabileceğini söyledi. Böyle bir arazi düşünelim ki çok çok kurak. Yani hayvanlar için besin yok. Nasıl başlanıyor böyle bir arazi?
I was asked this question at the end of the TED Talk. How did we begin? Years ago, when we first developed the idea, or I did, of planned grazing, a very big ranching company came to me. They were probably the biggest ranching company ever. Liebig's London-based company with big ranches in Paraguay, Uruguay, Argentina, Australia, Namibia, Zimbabwe. And they had a 1.25 million acre ranch, 60,000 cows on that. Now the southern end of the ranch had almost been abandoned. It had turned to desert. So we had a 100-mile drive, that'd be how many kilometers? A long way, in which we didn't even have a single perennial grass plant, not one. Animals were feeding on twigs, leaf fall, and when we got rain, some annual grass. On that situation, I said to them, look, I don't want you to take risk. I said, this is way back in the 1960s. I said, everybody says I'm wrong, so I can't ask you to take risk. So they said, what do you want to do? And I said, give me the worst land you've got, and let's see what we can do. So they gave 4,000 acres of the worst we could find in our whole country. Okay, so probably pretty as much as you've got here, as bad. Now, on that, I called it an advanced project. I didn't want to call it a trial, because I was going to try and make it fail. So I was going to try and see if we could make planned grazing fail. And I doubled the livestock immediately on that land. And I was wrong, so I went to 3 times the livestock on that land, and it just became grassland. Now, if I thought this was coming up, I could have shown you pictures of it. This is how we did it, a curve. Every biological function. You were conceived, grew slowly, slowly, faster and faster, were born, carried on born. If you're like me, you're shrinking. Okay? Every biological function is an S-shaped curve. So what I did was I took 4,000 acres of land, we'll just do it as a square. If I divide that in half, and this land is so poor, it can only support 20 goats, 50 goats, whatever. Those are eating twigs, whatever's there. There's always something there. Okay? If I divide this in half, can it hold them on this land for half the year? This land holds them for the whole year. So if I divide it in half, can I hold them there for half the year? Yes, I can. If I divide it like that, can I hold them there for 3 months? 90 days? Do you see what's happening? It's letting these plants grow. So I'm letting these plants grow into the steep part of the curve. When I have those animals over all the land every day, it's like me shaving my face every day on this side. On that side, my beard is growing. I'm shaving it every day. So after a couple of months, this side of my face will look like Durakan. And this side will be clean. You see it? When you've got the animals there all the time, they're shaving the plants, in effect. So by doing this, I reasoned that what I could do is, if I could then double the animals and let these plants grow, and I found I had too few, so then I trebled the animals and let these plants grow. That would work. So what I did in that case was I divided this up into many, and just did it like that, and there I put water and so on. And we went, as I say, to double the animals immediately, too few, went to 3 times the animals. So now on each piece of land, I've got 3 times as many animals, more crowded, all breaking the capped soil, all dunging and urinating, and then they're off it. And they're only 1 or 2 days. So they're very short time and off. And behind them, I'm letting all these plants grow. That's how we do it. Now, the only time we've ever had to feed is in mine reclamation. So where we've been helping mining companies, and they've got these mine dumps where there's nothing. There isn't even one plant. There's nothing to eat. And then we want to use the animals to get plants growing to stabilize the mine dumps. Then we use hay. So we do the same thing, but just give them hay to eat and to start the life building in the soil. Other than mine reclamation, we've never had to seed or feed.
Tarlanın o kısmını kındıralardan kurtarıp daha verimli hale getirebiliriz. Biraz çok özel bir şey oldu ama.
Okay. All right. If you've got, let me deal first with, if you've got a difficult plant there, a grass that's very difficult, you come back to basics. There's no technology won't solve it. People have spent billions of dollars. In America, they spend nearly $1 billion a year trying to kill problem plants. They haven't succeeded with a single plant in a single state. They've poisoned the environment, bankrupted farmers, unintended consequences. So technology is not likely to solve that, right? No, again, you come back to the decision making. The biggest chance is just using animals and changing the environment so that other plants come in. Plants don't invade. Plants don't compete. That's what we're taught at universities and so on. That's nonsense. It's a symbiotic relationship between everything, and the whole is what is functioning. Whole atoms, whole molecules, whole cells, whole organs, whole animals, whole communities. And nature tends to fill a vacuum. So if something there has, in management, has created the vacuum, the plant will come into it. And it might be an annual cheatgrass, whatever it is. Now, the best way of dealing with it, and we found this consistently, is to then change that environment. And the best way to do that is animals. Now, when you use the animals, general rule, much like I showed you in the pictures with our real problem sites, is the more animals you've got, the quicker it'll change. But we do find where we crowd a lot of animals onto a small area to heal or get it started, we do find we don't want to do that more than about a week. The longer we do it, the more the initial recovery is weeds, and then it becomes grasses. If we can do it for a week or so, it tends to be grasses that come in and start developing. So I would just encourage you to use animals crowded onto it. If they're not crowded onto it, it'll take a long time to change, if I'm picturing it right, what you have. So I would be trying to find some way of getting the most animals on it. Now, when you graze through an orchard or anything, right, yes, goats will tend to browse. Now, if it's, I don't know what if the trees are tall, and try to make the management very proactive, not reactive. So you will say, all right, I'm going to try sheep and goats in this, plan the grazing, very short periods of grazing, adequate recovery, assume I'm wrong, and on the trees just watch the browsing and see if they overbrowse, because they may not. I've got pictures of not orchards but wild trees, shrubs in Namibia, etc., that had complete browse lines from sheep and goats. And once we planned the grazing, I've got pictures of the same trees with long branches on them, no longer being overbrowsed. So I could only say, try it, assume you're wrong, watch it.
Başka sorular? Bir herkesin elini görürsem ona göre zaman yönetimini bütüncül bir şekilde yapalım. 1, 2 tane görüyorum şu anda, 3 tane görüyorum. Tamam, sizden başlayalım. Buyurun.
Kullandığınız yöntemde ilk aklıma gelen dezavantaj olabilecek problemi sormak istiyorum. Tohum taşı, hayvanlar aracılığıyla tohum istenmeyen bitkilerin taşınması konusunda bunu avantaja çevirecek bir yöntem var mı? Çünkü belki de orada önemli bir tür var ve hayvanlar tarafından istilacı bir tür oraya taşındığında, tohumlarının taşındığında acaba oradaki sistemi alt üst edecek bir sonuç doğurabilir mi? Böyle bir şey mümkün mü?
I think I've got it. If I've got you right, you're worried about animals carrying seeds to another area. Now, usually we're using that to advantage. In other words, if we've got an area where a particular plant would like to be there, but it isn't, we'll often graze them where that plant is when it's seeding and carry the seed that way through the dung, etc. Now, if your worry is the other way, seed has been spreading forever. There are no non-native species on this planet yet. Okay, that non-native term, I don't know if you use it in Turkey, it's used a lot in America, and I keep having to say to people there are no non-native species yet. Okay, species spread. If a volcanic eruption comes up way out in the Pacific, in no time there are plants growing on it. They get there. So seeds are traveling. The problem is not wanting too many of them. A plant becomes noxious or a weed or a problem when there's too many. What that generally means is that the management has created the conditions that are ideal for that plant to survive. Everything has a requirement for certain conditions. No plant is tough. No plant is hardy. And to get people to understand that, I sometimes use a human example. You could take a very tough, hardy kid from a Bushman family in the Kalahari Desert. I mean, it's so tough, it's unbelievable. He can live in that environment. Put him in Istanbul in the best hotel with wall-to-wall carpeting, air conditioning, hot bath, 3 meals a day, and he'd probably die. It's just not his environment. You could take a tough little kid from a gang, a street gang in the city of New York or whatever, give him to a bushman family to look after for a year and he'd probably die. You see, they're not hardy. They're totally adapted to their environment. So it is with every plant. So if a plant is becoming extremely problematic, the chances are 99% your management has created the conditions it favors. So the way we deal with that, and have been for years, is just to watch the conditions. Now, normally, when we do that, even the problem plants that people were wasting lots of money trying to kill, we don't have to kill. They just start to become less in the population. The whole diversity builds up. So more than that I can't tell you at this point without being on the ground, seeing it. I would not worry about it. Yeah, I really wouldn't. I would worry more about producing the conditions for high diversity of all plants. Your context. All right, but having said that, the chances are, yes, you just get help, get community going, get working with these guys, get the context, and then start looking at that. But generally, the more you can do that filtering that I talked about, what is the energy used, all of these things, you will come generally to using the animals as the biologically, economically best way of doing it. But the exact detail of it I can't say, but at least you're starting to work together, hopefully, work it out. Yeah. In the many years when I was first trying to develop something that would work, I worked as an international consultant across 5 countries in Africa at that time. I had my own plane and I flew to many ranches and so on. When we had finally, in 1984, got the idea of the holistic framework needing a context, etc., as I looked back on those years, although I was a highly paid consultant, about 90–95% of the advice I gave was wrong. I was no different from any consultants. Nearly all the advice we give is wrong because we haven't got the context. Only you have it, you see. So now, once I realized that, I realized, no, all we can do is teach people how to make the decisions. And that works, please believe me.
And bunu da İngilizce söyleyeyim. There is one more thing I wanted to add to what you said about care. I think I would like to add also love, which is also essential.
I accept that. Yeah. Caring to me is, yeah, it's the same. If you love the land. I loved my country, I loved the wildlife, I loved it all and cared enough. But coming to a question of, yes, what I've talked to you about today is profoundly simple. But if I was up here with a bicycle, describing to you how to ride the bicycle, you'd probably be sitting there saying, this is too difficult. But if I could just put you on the bicycle and help you, you'd be riding it quickly. It's the same with holistic management. I wish I never had to talk to people about it. I wish I could just be on a farm with somebody and just start doing it. And they would just say it's common sense and get it. It is that simple. Right now, to get you started with, this is why we're trying to get the hubs going, you helping each other, working, collaborating, learning from each other, teaching each other, because you learn so much by teaching. And we're trying through our institute to provide training materials that are very, very simple and easy. Now they've just been released new electronic stuff. You can buy the training stuff inexpensively and start to teach yourself over the internet using computer, etc. So that's available. If you go on the site, you'll find it there. I don't know if I've got that. No, I've got the Facebook site, yeah. But these guys will help you to find it. So there's training materials, everything. Jody Butterfield down there has been working for the last 4 or 5 years developing extremely simple training material for illiterate people. Most of you look as though you're beyond that. but we've even got it now for illiterate people, down to pictures and very simple training. We've got illiterate people, semi-literate people learning to do it. It really is easy. When I say to you it's easy, I just end with that. Somebody floored me many years ago. I was flying down to South America from North America, and the plane got stranded in Mexico City, and the airport was full, and I could only find one seat to sit at. And I asked the fellow there if I could sit at his table, and I did. And I got talking to him, and he was a civil engineer from Brazil. And we chatted for a while about what he did and so on. And then he asked what I did, and I dread that question. And I said, well, I'm trying to work on the biggest problem facing mankind, agriculture, you know, etc. And he said, how are you doing? And I said, actually, we're doing quite well. We've got some stuff working. It's really working. And he floored me. He said, it must be very simple. And I said, why do you say that? And he said, any time there's been a major problem for humanity, the solution has always been very simple. And that really stuck in my mind. And what I've talked to you about today is so simple. Okay. Pictures of the grasslands. Remember I showed you a high rainfall one in Zimbabwe, and then that excellent looking grassland that was desertifying. Where you spot it first, all right, is just looking between the plants, because you can get a grassland that looks very good, but if you look down between the plants, you find the basal area covers very little of the ground. When the ground is burnt, you really see how little the base of each plant is. It's that space between that is the key to it. And that space between needs to be covered with litter, soft, porous, water can get in, stay in. And so when I walk into even a tall grassland like this, I'm usually barefoot. I've only put shoes on for you guys. I usually go barefoot, and I can even feel it from my feet. If you walk on that carpet or you walk on this, you'll feel the difference immediately. So even as I'm walking through a grassland, I can feel what's happening underneath. So it's look down between the plants. That is very serious. In Namibia, years ago, there was a court case, and I won't go into all the details, but the government lost the case by using one piece of land that they described as perfection of management. And we asked them if there was any erosion. There was absolutely no erosion. The court was adjourned, and I spent a day on that land looking between the plants, sampling, and I think it was 98% of the ground was eroding, where experts had said it was perfection. So I just encourage you to look down between plants in grasslands. That's where you see the first sign of if it's going wrong or coming right. Just like the pictures I showed you, where that good-looking grassland was leading to terrible floods lower down the river. And the I've now missed the second point, please. Sorry? Windbreaks. Oh, windbreaks. Like anything, when we're managing holistically, if we had the actual site and you said windbreaks, we would say, good idea. Remember, we don't want to start a conflict. So if anybody ever says to you, no, that's a bad idea, you get defensive. So every idea that comes up when you are managing holistically, always say, it's a good idea, now let's look. And then you'd have to have the context, the holistic context in that area, and look at what the cost of the windbreaks, how they're going to be done, where's the energy coming from, where's the money coming from, what's the pattern of use, does it have compound interest attached? You've got to look at all of that in context, and then you'll say, yes, a good idea, or no. And very often windbreaks are put in and needed for animals to help the grassland, but in my experience, very seldom to help the grassland. They've managed without it for millions of years. But often we will put them in to provide windbreaks or snow breaks or whatever to help animals. Does that help?
Sorunuza cevap oldu mu?
Some of you are irrigating some fields to get grass. And now when I'm imagining we are making holistic management, in the summer I could imagine we have grass like this. and then to get enough energy out of the grass. So how can we do? Because with the fresh grass, of course, they like it and they eat it, and then they can produce a lot of milk. But out of the grass like this, it's more cellulose. So maybe don't get so much milk like the fresh grass. So.
I'm not.
What about actually carbon and the protein ratio? So how the dry grass will help them to produce milk when it's fresh? It's okay. If it's that way.
Yeah, again, I don't know without seeing that far one, but some of the things that can be done when you plan the grazing, right? Whether it's cows or sheep or whatever, if very high performance is what's required, like it is with milking, okay? Then what people do is they find at times, and even with trying to put on beef, if the animals are getting too much green leaf, etc., and the dung becomes very sloppy and they're not producing well, all they do is start dividing the land up into paddocks or divisions, planning the grazing, but letting the animals have the new area and the old area. So it actually, the animals move into the new, but they can go back onto what they were on the day before or 2 days before and balance their diet. Usually animals are trying to balance their diet. And if you're giving them nothing but too much green, at times it can be a problem. Now, again, conversely, when everything is very dry, etc., but we've got some areas that are green in a valley or whatever, we'll often try and plan the grazing so that they're part of a day on one, part of a day on the other. So in the planned grazing, there may be things you can do. At the end of the day, you may have to supplement. Now, we try to avoid that as much as we can because of cost. So you'll have to do everything you can through the planning of the grazing, and if it has to be taken to another level, then you would consider supplementing something. But what we try to avoid in any situation is feeding, as opposed to supplementing. Supplementing what is lacking in the vegetation, as opposed to bulk feeding. Bulk feeding becomes terribly expensive. More than that, I can't help without seeing it. In my mind, a lot, because we're facing it all over the place. In Africa, where I live, we have a collapsed state where I am, and I've been watching the BBC and trying to follow what's happening there. Let me just say two things. One is everybody in that conflict is doing what we're all doing. They have objectives, okay? Same as we're all making decisions. What I've learned in my life is that's what causes conflict. If some of us in this room have an objective with inadequate context, and others in the room have another objective, we get to arguing, fighting, and killing over our different objectives. Now, I had to go through a very long civil war. I was 20 years in the army fighting a civil war, and then ending up trying to end it as a political leader. And when the war had ended, and we killed 30,000 of ourselves in that war, when it had ended, I was running a workshop back in my country with a mixed group of us. We're two main tribes, and then we've got a few whites, and the rest are two main black tribes. And we needed to work on some policies, and we needed a holistic context for us. And we were limited on time. So I said to them, we can develop it together, or if you like, I've written one and I can read it, and then you change whatever you like. They said, well, do that. So I read out what, for me, our country, all of us want. And I read that out, and there was just total silence. Absolute silence. Nobody moved, nobody said anything. For a long time. And the first person to speak, his exact words were, Christ, if we'd only known, we wouldn't have fought the war. We wouldn't have fought the war. We had no idea that everybody in the country wanted the same thing. We had different objectives, and we'd just killed 30,000 people. So I'm very conscious of this, that this is a way to begin to solve those issues. Now, when it comes to doing it in countries, an autocratic country could begin to do this. A small country deep in trouble, which is why I keep working with my country, because we're in that position. In a democracy, it cannot happen till the majority of people are saying we need to be forming policies holistically. What I am doing at the moment is I've had 40 years out of that life now nearly, and I had many people urge me to stay in. And I said, no, I'm getting out because I must get back to my scientific work, which is more important. And I said, the second reason is I don't want to be in government because I don't know how to govern. I'm not prepared to do a job I don't know how to do. I only went in to try to end a war. I didn't know how to govern a country. But I've had time to think about it. So I am right now writing a short book on governance. The scientific reasons why no government can govern well, no government can, because of the policies is the main role of governments, and some structural reasons. And funny enough, when I wrote the first draft and gave it to some people to read, one of them asked me if I'd ever read George Washington's Farewell to the Nation. And I hadn't, so I read it. And what I thought was original thinking, he'd already thought it out 200 years ago, or whenever it was. Okay? And essentially that is that as long as we have political parties, we make good governance impossible. Political parties have to go. There's no need to have political parties. That's an idea that rose in Britain long ago, and it's not relevant for the world. So there are structural reasons in place. So I hope to get that out in a simple book, easily read by young people all over, because otherwise we're going to have more things like Arab Springs, where young people rebel against authority, they want to change things, and when that happened, I predicted right then they would jump out of the frying pan into the fire. It gets worse because they haven't got an alternative way of governing sensibly. So at my age, I just like to give those ideas to younger people, and what they do is up to them. Politicians, you need government, but all I'm saying to you, and it's not my view, I'm following really what I read from Lord Eric Ashby's research. He looked at Britain and America as his case study over the last 200 years to see how new thinking gets into a democratic society. And what he found is if it's new thinking, and leadership always involves new way, a way forward, essentially. That's what your leaders are doing by leading. And what he found is if something is truly new thinking, your leaders in democratic institutions cannot bring it in. They cannot act until people at the club, around the football field, in the pub, are saying when are they going to do it, and enough people are saying it, then they can change. If they try to change before then, they get rejected. So for example, I've been watching this in America, many people condemning Obama for not leading on climate change. He cannot. He's beginning to as the public demand increases. He cannot run ahead of that public demand. If he did, he'd be out, rejected. I know, because I was told I was the most defeated politician in the history of my country. I didn't want that title, but I tried to lead. And afterwards, they all said we should have listened. And I said, well, you didn't. But I hadn't read his research when I went into it, thinking I could lead.
Thank you very much, Allan. Okay.